Hello, I'm Sophie Lazel, author of Measure of Days, a science fiction novel for young adults, which is now available online and in all good bookshops. I'd like to share my experience as an author with you and how it has helped me. Creative writing is powerful. My personal experience of it has helped me to sift through my feelings and given me perspective when dealing with challenges. I highly recommend it as a way of improving your health and well-being. So I'm going to talk about what led me to write my trilogy and the themes and ideas behind it. Those themes are climate change, political unrest, human survival and bravery in the face of adversity. I hope that they will give you plenty to think about and reinforce the positive messages that literature can bring. So, very briefly, a bit about me. I am a mother, and my daughter Amelia is now 20, and her sister Jemima would be 22 if she were still alive. Jemima died at the age of 13, and it is her that helped me begin my novel writing journey. Prior to that, I have co-written 4 musicals for Make Theatre Youth Company, which toured locally and at the Edinburgh Fringe. I've also put together copy for various websites and documents for record keeping and press releases, mainly for the charity that we set up in my daughter's name. I had no television growing up, so I had to read a lot to fill in my time, and I certainly think that helped to develop my imagination. Measure of Days is a young adult science fiction novel set in an imagined future. The world has been plagued by a terrible flesh-eating disease for many years, and people have had to change how they live, relying on organ transplants and prosthetics. The young people have formed a group called the Faction, and they're angry that there's been no vaccine created yet. They want answers, and they're determined to overthrow the old order, the establishment. The Faction hear about a girl called Dita Edison, who is immune to the flesh-eating disease, and they realise that if they could access her DNA, then maybe they might have a chance at creating their own vaccine. That's where the story starts. I will warn you, it's very fast-paced and has multiple points of view, which is quite unusual, and some people have found that hard to get into. I will share some of the best and worst reviews later. So let's talk about living in the wider world first. For literature to come to life, it relies on a strong sense of place, whatever that might be. It might be a rural background, a city, or even a school setting. And as the writer, if you can picture it all really clearly in your mind, down to the last detail, it helps make it very real for the reader. So if you're interested in creative writing, wherever you may be observant, be present in that moment so that you can describe it at a later date. So are there any books that spring to mind that you've read that have future or imagined worlds? Just have a quick think. I'm sure you can come up with a few. And try and remember how you felt reading it. Did you fully believe in that world? And if so, why? And if not, why not? I chose to set my story, Measure of Days, in an imagined future world, so I had to construct it from other borrowed ideas, predictions, and things that I have seen and read. I spent some time using current indicators to build my imagined world. There are people whose entire job is to do just that. They are known as futurists, and they look at how they think the world will change based on current trends and events. And one of their main concerns is, of course, climate change. The increased frequency of wildfires, the decrease in fresh water, the rise in temperature, and the impact this all has on disease and agriculture and the rise in sea level. All these I've taken into account, and my book is set roughly 500 years from now. My imagined future world is mainly covered in water. Not as extreme as the film Waterworld, where there is nothing but ocean, but it's a world where the sea has encroached on land and threatened major cities and is now permanent on areas where flash floods occur. We already have flash floods, rising sea level and storms, and they are predicted to increase in severity and frequency. So, do you know somewhere local to you that suffers from flash flooding? Imagine if that was permanent. How do you think the residents would adapt to life? Maybe have a look on Google. If you put in rising sea level, you can access some really interesting maps that predict how the world will look in 100 years, 500 years, and you can type in any part of the world to see specific results. So I worked on the rough guide of the sea level rising a foot every 100 years. Those are figures from Wikipedia, which I know we shouldn't always believe everything we read. But at the time that I wrote the book in 2016-17, there was universal discussion about the role that flood barriers can play in protecting cities. We have one on the entrance of the Thames. It's one of the largest movable barriers in the world. You can have a look and see for yourself on the government website, gov.uk. And part of my book is also set in New York, where they are also discussing the possibility of building a 6-mile flood barrier. And this is something that's been in the news recently in January, I think, at the beginning of this year. And it will cost $119 billion. The current design has, however, been criticised for being oversimplistic because it doesn't take into account the long-term rising sea levels or how to distribute build-up of waste from inside the barrier. So using what I knew about existing flood barriers, I then created my own. And I wanted my flood wall to be cinematic. I watched films like The Day After Tomorrow, 2012 and Flood, and I wanted my wall to be huge. So in my book, I have a vast series of walls running almost all around New York, encircling it in a protective bubble. It lets traffic in and out through a lock-style system, and the walls themselves are also used as hotels, gyms and restaurants as a first and last stop for travellers. Travel and transportation has become predominantly by boat, and this affects the development of different cultures as they each become more centralised and less affected by globalisation. Add into this the flesh-eating disease pandemic, and communities become even more isolated and self-reliant. Communal gardening is vital for the people in my novel. They utilise all green spaces because feeding the population is a struggle, so growing crops on wastelands, on rooftops, and instead of parks for recreation, they now are using them for grazing herds, a bit like common land in the medieval period. Rooftop gardening is already a growing trend in New York, and during lockdown, I was very pleased to note that one of the first things people did was work on their vegetable plots and buy chickens. So it showed that my predictions were not too far-fetched and are actually quite plausible. So that's the physical world in Measure of Days and how I came to create it. As I said, world building for any dystopian or science fiction novel is the foundation of the story. Now that we have that, we can add further dynamics. So in most stories, there's an element of old versus new or good versus evil. Conflict and resolution is a concept that's universally understood regardless of faith and culture, and it has multiple variations. There's almost always a hero fighting a monster, and in my case, it's the old establishment being challenged by the new political group, the Faction. Faction believes the establishment has failed to provide the people with a safe cure or vaccine, and they believe they can create one. I have made a conscious effort to write from the perspective of both those that might be perceived as good and those that might be perceived as bad, without being too judgmental. I'm not always successful, but an evil character doesn't necessarily think of themselves as such, and I think it's important to remember that. Stories inevitably have a quest element. In my case, it's the search for a vaccine. I chose a flesh-eating disease because it's a real thing. Have a look on the NHS website under necrotizing fasciitis. It's rare and it can be treated by removal of damaged tissue and antibiotics, but there is no vaccine. It is, however, not contagious. In my story, it has evolved to become contagious, and I wrote this way before COVID-19, but we all know now how quickly diseases can spread and how they can change the way we live almost overnight. Now imagine how it would be if a disease leaves you with amputated limbs and damaged organs. Organ transplants and prosthetics suddenly become absolutely vital. The disease affects everyone, so all the people who survive this disease have a degree of disability, and in measure of days this has become completely normal. Throughout the world at the moment, now in 2020, organ transplants are viewed very differently. In England, as from May this year, we now have an opt-out system. In some countries, organs are still bought and sold illegally. In Iran, however, it is legal. In Israel, you are most likely to receive one if you're on the donor list. And in Pakistan, blood from recovered corona patients is being sold on the black market. People are desperate for a cure. So all around the world, there's very, very different viewpoints about organ and blood transplants. A vaccine or a safe cure is the main concern for the faction in my novel. When they discover that they have an immune called Dita, she is viewed as incredibly rare and valuable. In novels, people refer to this as a chosen one plotline. So the faction kidnap her, and that's how Measure of Days starts. So there you have the inspiration behind my novel and how I believe that literature and creative writing can help us in our understanding of our health, well-being, and living in the wider world. It's strange how Measure of Days has so many parallels to life today. I certainly didn't anticipate that when I wrote it. And the very last theme that I wanted to talk to you about is the one that's probably the most relevant to you today. For maybe you are a chosen one on a quest, facing a battle against evil. And the theme I wanted to talk about is friendship and bravery in the face of adversity. So Dita would not be able to undertake the adventure without Lincoln. True friendship is rare and valuable, and we must treasure our friends. Don't underestimate how important they are to your life, for you never know when you might need them and when they might need you. So how does that translate into everyday life? Well, for example, how many times have you looked forward to a match and then it begins to rain? And yet you're still expected to play, despite the fact it's cold, it's wet, visibility is terrible, and the ball keeps slipping. Don't forget that you and your friends are in it together. Keep thinking positively. Focus on the task of supporting your teammates and friends and on playing a clean, strong game. This happens in my book, only it's not a match, it's a battle. So this is similar, but different, slightly different. For example, you might feel that social distancing is the biggest obstacle right now. It's getting in the way of having proper lessons, being able to do the stuff you love, going to the cinema, going to the theatre. Be creative, find ways around those obstacles. Dita and Lincoln think they have nowhere safe to live, but they keep going until a solution presents itself. And lastly, don't let trauma impact in a negative way. I'd say that the coronavirus is possibly the most traumatic thing to happen to all of us this year. Many people have lost loved ones, and everyone has had to make sacrifices. We can use this experience to build our resilience and ability to create new things so we've reacted creatively to trauma. My trauma of losing my daughter gave me the impetus to start writing. Everything I learnt about her situation I have used to help inform my book. The organ transplant stuff, that comes from her. She donated all her organs and is the UK's record holder for the most recipients. My work for her charity has been so interesting and rewarding and helped to inform my novel. You never know where inspiration will come from, so squirrel those ideas away. Research stuff that interests you, regardless of whether it's part of a school lesson or not. Store that information for a later date because you never know when it will come in handy. So I hope that you will read Measure of Days now that you know a bit more about it. Any questions about the book or about the writing process, do ask. You can contact me through my website, sophielazel.com. And I'm going to leave you with some of my best reviews and also some of the worst. Then you must make your own mind up about whether you want to read it. Decide quite soon, though, because this is the first edition and it's a short run, and you will kick yourself if I turn out to be the next J.K. Rowling. So options for ordering are from Amazon, foils or Waterstones, and the links are available on my website. So here we go. This is the worst, and I will end on the best.